A nation determined to stay out of war until the morning, everything changed. In the autumn of 1941, the United States stood as a nation caught between principle and reality. Across the Atlantic, Britain fought alone against Nazi Germany. Across the Pacific, Japan's imperial ambitions sprawled across China and Southeast Asia. Yet America remained officially neutral, bound by public sentiment that still remembered the trenches of the First World War. The isolationist movement was powerful, vocal, and determined. Mothers wrote to Congress, pleading that their sons not be sent to fight another European war. Senator Gerald Nye warned that American involvement would only serve the interests of bankers and arms manufacturers. Even as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt maneuvered cautiously toward supporting the Allies, he faced a nation deeply reluctant to enter another global conflict. But neutrality was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. In September 1940, Roosevelt had signed the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, trading 50 aging destroyers to Britain in exchange for military base rights in the Caribbean and Newfoundland. By March 1941, the Lend-Lease Act allowed the United States to supply war material to Britain, China, and later the Soviet Union without direct payment. America was inching closer to war, yet still avoiding it. Roosevelt's strategy was clear: support the democracies without sending American boys to die. But in the Pacific, tensions with Japan were escalating beyond diplomatic control. Japan had been waging war in China since 1937, committing atrocities that horrified the American public. By 1941, Japanese forces occupied French Indochina, threatening British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the American-controlled Philippines. In response, the United States imposed oil and steel embargoes, cutting off resources vital to Japan's war machine. The Japanese Empire, faced with the choice between withdrawal or expansion, chose expansion. Diplomatic negotiations in Washington continued through the autumn, but beneath the surface, Japan's military leadership was preparing for war. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, had devised a daring plan. He knew that in a prolonged war, American industrial power would crush Japan. But if Japan could deliver a devastating blow to the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, it might buy enough time to secure Southeast Asia's resources and force America into a negotiated peace. Yamamoto was skeptical. He had studied at Harvard and understood American resilience. He reportedly said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Yet, orders were orders, and by late November 1941, a strike force of 6 aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines was steaming eastward across the North Pacific, maintaining strict radio silence. Meanwhile, in Hawaii, life continued with the rhythms of peacetime. Pearl Harbor was home to the United States Pacific Fleet, the most powerful concentration of American naval strength. Battleships lined up along Battleship Row, Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Aircraft carriers Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were based there, though fortunately none would be in port on the morning of December 7th. Sailors enjoyed weekend liberty in Honolulu. Officers played golf. Families attended Sunday church services. The tropical sun warmed the island, and the blue waters of the harbor sparkled in the morning light. There were warning signs, though they were not heeded. American cryptanalysts had broken Japan's diplomatic codes, intercepting messages that suggested war was imminent. On December 6th, Roosevelt read a decoded message known as the 14-part message, which effectively severed diplomatic relations. He remarked, "This means war." Yet, the message did not specify where or when. Intelligence officers in Washington assumed the Philippines would be the target, if anywhere. Pearl Harbor seemed too far, too risky for Japan to strike. Even when radar operators on Oahu detected incoming aircraft at 7:02 on the morning of December 7th, They were told it was probably a flight of American B-17 bombers expected from the mainland. The assumption of safety would prove catastrophic. At approximately 7:48 that Sunday morning, the first wave of Japanese aircraft, 183 planes, including torpedo bombers, dive bombers, horizontal bombers, and fighters, descended upon Pearl Harbor. The second wave, 170 planes, would follow an hour later. In total, 353 aircraft launched from the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. Their mission was simple: destroy the American Pacific Fleet and cripple American air power in Hawaii. What followed was 2 hours of devastation that would reshape the world. The calm of that Sunday morning shattered in an instant. As the first bombs fell and torpedoes sliced through the water toward Battleship Row, sailors scrambled from their bunks, officers ran to their posts, and the entire base erupted into chaos. Smoke billowed into the tropical sky, mixing with the cries of wounded men and the roar of explosions. For the United States, the era of neutrality was over. America had been forced into war not by choice, but by an attack so audacious, so devastating, that it left no room for debate. And in that moment, the course of history pivoted. The question was no longer whether America would fight, it was how swiftly and how decisively it would rise to meet the challenge. When the bombs began to fall, no one was ready. The first wave struck at 7:48 on the morning of December 7th, 1941. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the Japanese attack, looked down at Pearl Harbor and saw the American fleet arranged in neat rows, unprotected and unprepared. He radioed back the coded message, "Tora, Tora, Tora, Tiger, Tiger, Tiger," signaling that complete surprise had been achieved. Within seconds, the sky above Oahu filled with the scream of dive bombers and the thunder of explosions. Torpedo bombers from the Japanese carriers skimmed low over the water, releasing modified aerial torpedoes specifically designed for the shallow harbor. These weapons, fitted with wooden fins to prevent them from diving too deep, raced toward Battleship Row. The USS Oklahoma was struck by 4 torpedoes in rapid succession. The massive battleship shuddered, listed heavily to port, and within minutes capsized entirely, trapping over 400 men inside her hull. Sailors on deck leapt into the oil-slicked water, swimming desperately as the ship rolled over above them. Some were pulled under by the suction. Others clung to the overturned hull, pounding on the steel, hoping rescue would come. Nearby, the USS West Virginia took 6 torpedo hits and 2 bomb strikes. Her captain, Mervyn Bennion, was mortally wounded by shrapnel on the bridge, but remained at his post, directing damage control until he succumbed to his injuries. The ship settled onto the harbor bottom, but counter-flooding efforts kept her upright, preventing the catastrophic capsizing that claimed the Oklahoma. Sailors fought fires, carried wounded comrades to safety, and struggled to make sense of the chaos erupting around them. Then came the moment that would define the attack. At approximately 8:06, a Japanese bomber dropped an armor-piercing bomb, a modified 16-inch naval shell, that struck the forward ammunition magazine of the USS Arizona. The explosion was cataclysmic. A fireball erupted from the ship's center, blasting the forward turrets into the air and sending a mushroom cloud of smoke and debris thousands of feet into the sky. The shockwave was felt across the harbor. The battleship broke apart and sank in less than 9 minutes, taking 1,177 men, with her nearly half of all American casualties that day. Sailors on nearby ships watched in horror as flames consumed the wreckage. Oil from ruptured fuel tanks spread across the water, igniting into a sea of fire. Men who jumped overboard to escape the inferno found themselves swimming through burning oil, their skin blistering, their lungs choking on smoke. Across the harbor, chaos reigned. The USS California took 2 torpedo hits and began to flood. Damage control teams fought valiantly to save the ship, but poor watertight integrity allowed seawater to spread through compartments, and she slowly settled onto the harbor bottom. The USS Nevada, moored alone at the northern end of Battleship Row, managed to get underway despite a torpedo hit. Her crew hoped to escape the harbor and reach open water. But as she moved toward the channel, Japanese dive bombers swarmed her, seeking to sink her in the narrow passage and block the entire fleet. Bombs struck her deck, igniting fires and causing heavy casualties. Realizing the danger, her captain deliberately beached the ship at Hospital Point to avoid blocking the harbor entrance. Even in the midst of destruction, discipline, and quick thinking prevented an even greater disaster. American air power was targeted just as ruthlessly. At Wheeler Field, Hickam Field, Bellows Field, and the naval air stations at Ford Island and Kaneohe Bay, Japanese fighters strafed rows of American aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, an arrangement designed to prevent sabotage, but which made them perfect targets for aerial attack. Explosions rippled across the airfields as planes erupted into flames. Pilots sprinted toward their aircraft, desperate to get into the air, but most were destroyed before they could take off. Only a handful of American fighters, P-40 Warhawks and P-36 Hawks, managed to engage the attackers, shooting down several Japanese planes in fierce dogfights. Lieutenant George Welch and Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor became early heroes, taking off from Halewa Field and downing multiple enemy aircraft despite being outnumbered and outgunned. On the ground and in the water, individual acts of courage emerged from the chaos. Messman Doris Miller, an African-American sailor assigned to the West Virginia, carried wounded men to safety and then manned an anti-aircraft gun, despite having no training on the weapon, and fired at attacking planes until ordered to abandon ship. His actions earned him the Navy Cross, making him one of the first African-American heroes of the war. At Hickam Field, medics ran through machine gun fire to reach wounded airmen. At the Naval Hospital, doctors and nurses worked through the carnage, treating burns, shrapnel wounds, and trauma cases as casualties poured in. Blood supplies ran out within hours. Bandages were improvised from torn sheets. The hospital overflowed with the wounded and the dying. By the time the second wave concluded at approximately 9:45, the devastation was overwhelming. 8 battleships had been damaged or destroyed, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and several auxiliary vessels were sunk or heavily damaged. 188 American aircraft were destroyed, and another 159 were damaged. Most devastating of all were the human casualties: 2,400, 3 Americans killed, and 1,178 wounded. Entire crews were lost. Families would receive telegrams in the coming days, informing them that their sons, husbands, and brothers were missing or dead. The attack had lasted less than 2 hours, but the scars would endure for a lifetime. Yet amid the destruction, there were signs of resilience. The USS Pennsylvania, flagship of the Pacific Fleet, was in dry dock during the attack and suffered only moderate damage. Critically, none of the American aircraft carriers were in port that day. Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island. Lexington was en route to Midway, and Saratoga was undergoing maintenance on the West Coast. The carriers would become the backbone of America's Pacific counteroffensive, and their survival was a stroke of fortune. Additionally, the Japanese had failed to target Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks, repair facilities, and submarine base infrastructure that would prove vital in the months ahead. As the last Japanese aircraft disappeared over the horizon, returning to their carriers, the harbor fell into an eerie, smoke-filled silence. Fires still raged aboard sunken ships. Rescue crews pulled survivors from the water. Divers prepared to cut through the hulls of capsized vessels to reach men trapped inside. The scale of the disaster was staggering, but even in those first hours, something else began to take shape, something the attackers had not anticipated. Across America, as news of the attack spread, shock gave way to fury. Isolationism evaporated overnight. The question was no longer whether to enter the war, it was how quickly America could mobilize its vast industrial and military power to strike back. From shock and grief to unity and resolve overnight, The news reached the American mainland in waves, each more shocking than the last. Radio broadcasts interrupted Sunday afternoon programming with urgent bulletins. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. Families gathered around their radios, disbelief giving way to anger. In living rooms, diners, churches, and movie theaters, Americans absorbed the reality that their nation had been attacked without warning, without a declaration of war. The shock was profound, but the response was immediate and overwhelming. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt received word of the attack while at the White House. He had been expecting conflict, but not this, not a strike so bold, so devastating, so far from Japan's home waters. That evening, he convened his cabinet and military advisers. The mood was grim but determined. Roosevelt dictated a message to Congress, crafting the speech that would define America's entry into the war. He rejected earlier drafts that were lengthy and explanatory, opting instead for brevity and moral clarity. The next day, December 8, 1941, he would deliver one of the most famous speeches in American history. At 12:30 in the afternoon on December 8, Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress. His voice, steady and resolute, carried across the nation via radio. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. He detailed the coordinated attacks not only on Pearl Harbor, but also on Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippines, Wake Island, and Midway. He spoke of the deception practiced by Japanese diplomats who continued negotiations in Washington even as the strike force steamed toward Hawaii. And then, with the full weight of presidential authority, he declared, "With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God." I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. The response was thunderous. Congress voted for war with only one dissenting vote, Representative Jeannette Rankin of Montana, a lifelong pacifist. Within hours, America was officially at war. 3 days later, on December 11th, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy declared war on the United States, fulfilling their obligations under the Tripartite Pact. Roosevelt and Congress responded in kind, and suddenly, the United States was engaged in a two-ocean global conflict against the Axis powers. But America's entry into the war was not just a political or military decision, it was a national transformation. Across the country, the mood shifted from shock to steely determination. Recruitment centers were overwhelmed with volunteers, young men lined up by the thousands, eager to enlist in the Army, Navy, Marines, and Coast Guard. By the end of December, enlistment rates had surged beyond the capacity of training facilities to handle them. The military, which had numbered fewer than 200,000 active duty personnel in 1939, would swell to over 12 million by war's end. Women, too, answered the call. They joined the Women's Army Corps, WAC, the Navy Waves, the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, and the Coast Guard, SPARS. They worked as nurses, mechanics, pilots, and clerical staff, freeing men for combat roles. Rosie the Riveter became the symbol of female empowerment as millions of women entered factories, shipyards, and munitions plants. They welded steel, assembled aircraft, and built tanks. American industry, dormant during the Great Depression, roared to life with a speed and scale that astonished the world. The transformation was not limited to the military and factories. Civilians organized scrap metal drives, collecting everything from old car parts to tin cans to support the war effort. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards across the nation, supplementing food supplies and reducing the burden on agricultural production. Rationing was introduced for gasoline, rubber, sugar, meat, and other essentials. Americans accepted these sacrifices willingly, understanding that every ounce of material, every gallon of fuel, and every dollar contributed to defeating the Axis. The financial mobilization was equally staggering. The United States government launched war bond campaigns, urging citizens to invest in the war effort. Hollywood stars like Rita Hayworth and James Cagney toured the country promoting bonds. Posters proclaimed, "Buy war bonds, back the attack." Over the course of the war, Americans would purchase $85 billion worth of bonds, providing critical funding for military operations. The national debt soared, but so did national unity. In the Pacific, however, the situation remained dire. In the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces launched a coordinated offensive across the region. They invaded the Philippines, overran Guam, and besieged Wake Island. British-held Hong Kong fell on December 25, 1941, a grim Christmas present for the Allies. Singapore, considered the Gibraltar of the East, would fall in February 1942, one of Britain's most humiliating defeats. The Dutch East Indies collapsed under Japanese assault, depriving the Allies of critical oil supplies. By mid-1942, Japan controlled a vast empire, stretching from Burma to the Central Pacific. American forces in the Philippines, led by General Douglas MacArthur, fought a desperate defense. Outnumbered and undersupplied, they fell back to the Bataan Peninsula, where they held out for months in brutal conditions. When Bataan finally fell in April 1942, over 70,000 American and Filipino prisoners were subjected to the infamous Bataan Death March, a forced march of over 60 miles in which thousands died from exhaustion, dehydration, and Japanese brutality. MacArthur, who had been ordered to evacuate to Australia, vowed, "I shall return." Despite these losses, American resolve did not waver. In fact, the early defeats only hardened determination. The attack on Pearl Harbor had unified the nation in a way that no speech or policy ever could. Isolationism was dead. America was now fully committed to total war, and its industrial and military might was mobilizing at a pace that the Axis powers had not anticipated. Factories operated around the clock. Shipyards launched new vessels every few days. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines by the thousands. The United States, with its vast resources, technological innovation, and population of over 130 million, was gearing up to become what Roosevelt would call the arsenal of democracy. Japan's gamble at Pearl Harbor had achieved tactical surprise, but it failed strategically. Instead of demoralizing America into negotiation, it ignited a fury that would not be quenched until total victory. Admiral Yamamoto's fears proved prescient. The sleeping giant was awake, and it was filling with a terrible resolve. As 1942 began, America faced a brutal learning curve. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. The Philippines were falling. Confidence in American invincibility was shattered. But beneath the surface, something unstoppable was building, a military and industrial juggernaut that would, in time, turn the tide of war and reshape the world order forever. How America transformed industry, science, and society into an unstoppable war machine. In the months following Pearl Harbor, the United States faced a daunting challenge: how to mobilize a peacetime economy for total war, while simultaneously expanding its military from a modest force into the most powerful fighting machine the world had ever seen. The answer lay in America's unmatched industrial capacity, innovative spirit, and the willingness of its citizens to sacrifice for victory. What followed was a transformation so rapid and so comprehensive that it redefined modern warfare and cemented American dominance for decades to come. The backbone of this transformation was American industry. Even before Pearl Harbor, factories had begun converting to military production under Lend-Lease. But after December 7th, the transition became total. Automobile plants stopped making cars and started producing tanks, jeeps, and aircraft engines. Ford's Willow Run factory in Michigan became the largest assembly line in the world, churning out B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate of 1 per hour by 1944. General Motors, Chrysler, and other automakers produced trucks, half-tracks, and ammunition. In total, American factories built over 300,000 aircraft during the war, more than Germany, Japan, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined. Shipbuilding reached equally staggering levels. At the outbreak of war, the United States had a robust but limited shipbuilding capacity. By 1943, American shipyards were launching vessels at a pace that defied belief. Liberty ships, standardized cargo vessels, essential for transporting troops and supplies, were being completed in as little as 42 days. Henry Kaiser, an industrialist with no prior shipbuilding experience, revolutionized the process using prefabricated sections and welding instead of riveting. By war's end, American shipyards had built over 5,000 merchant ships, including Liberty ships, Victory ships, and tankers. The U.S. Navy expanded from fewer than 800 vessels in 1941 to over 6,000 by 1945, including 27 aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. Japan, meanwhile, struggled to replace losses. The industrial surge was supported by an unprecedented mobilization of labor. Unemployment, which had plagued America throughout the Great Depression, vanished almost overnight. Factories ran 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. Workers poured into industrial centers from rural areas, lured by high wages and patriotic duty. Women, who had traditionally been excluded from heavy industry, became indispensable. By 1945, women made up over 1/3 of the American workforce. They operated cranes, welded hulls, assembled engines, and inspected munitions. Photographs of women in coveralls and hard hats became iconic symbols of the home front. Meanwhile, the scientific community mobilized to develop technologies that would give America a decisive edge. The Manhattan Project, initiated in 1942, brought together the world's leading physicists to develop the atomic bomb. Under the leadership of J. Robert Oppenheimer and General Leslie Groves, research facilities at Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford worked in secrecy on what would become the most powerful weapon in history. The project consumed $2 billion and employed over 100 to 30,000 people, all without public knowledge. By 1945, the bomb would be ready, and its use against Japan would bring the war to a swift and devastating conclusion. Other innovations were equally critical. American engineers developed radar systems, proximity fuses, and sonar that dramatically improved anti-aircraft and anti-submarine warfare. The Norden bomb sight allowed high-altitude precision bombing, while advances in cryptography, most notably the breaking of Japanese naval codes, provided intelligence advantages that shaped key battles. American ingenuity extended to medicine as well. Penicillin, mass-produced for the first time during the war, saved countless lives on the battlefield. Blood plasma preservation techniques revolutionized combat medicine, allowing wounded soldiers to receive transfusions even in remote locations. Back in the military sphere, the armed forces expanded at a breathtaking pace. Training camps sprang up across the country, transforming civilians into soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. Boot camp lasted weeks, not months, and standards were adjusted to accommodate the sheer volume of recruits. Officer candidates attended accelerated courses at West Point, Annapolis, and specialized schools. By 1943, the United States had built an army of over 8 million men and women, supported by a navy and air force that rivaled or exceeded any other nation. The logistical effort required to supply this global force was staggering. The United States had to feed, clothe, arm, and transport millions of troops across 2 oceans, while simultaneously supplying allies in Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and elsewhere. The Red Ball Express, a convoy system that transported supplies from Normandy to frontline units after D-Day, became legendary for its efficiency. American quartermaster units managed supply chains that stretched from factories in Detroit to battlefields in New Guinea, North Africa, and Europe. The scale and complexity of this operation had never been attempted before, and its success demonstrated American organizational prowess. But the industrial and military buildup was not without challenges. Rationing strained civilian life. Sugar, meat, butter, gasoline, and rubber were all restricted. Families were issued ration books, and black markets emerged despite government efforts to suppress them. Housing shortages plagued industrial centers as workers flooded in faster than homes could be built. Racial tensions flared as African Americans migrated north for factory jobs, leading to riots in cities like Detroit in 1943. Japanese Americans on the West Coast faced a darker fate. Executive Order 9066, signed by Roosevelt in February 1942, authorized their forced relocation to internment camps. Over 120,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of them U.S. citizens, were incarcerated without trial, their properties seized or sold. This stain on American democracy would not be officially acknowledged and apologized for until the 1980s. Despite these injustices and hardships, the overall narrative of the home front was one of unity and determination. Hollywood produced patriotic films that bolstered morale. Musicians wrote songs celebrating the troops and mocking the Axis leaders. Newspapers published daily war updates, and families hung service flags in their windows, a blue star for each member serving, a gold star for each who had fallen. The shared sacrifice created a sense of national purpose that transcended regional, class, and political divides. By mid-1943, the industrial mobilization had reached full stride. American factories were producing weapons, vehicles, and supplies at a rate that the Axis could not match. The advantage was not just quantitative, it was qualitative. American technology, logistics, and training gave its forces a decisive edge. The tide of war was beginning to turn, not just because of battlefield victories, but because America had transformed itself into what Roosevelt had envisioned, the arsenal of democracy. In the Pacific, the fruits of this mobilization were starting to show. New carriers, planes, and ships were arriving at the front. Marines and soldiers, trained and equipped with the best gear American industry could produce, were preparing for the island-hopping campaigns that would bring the war to Japan's doorstep. The dark days following Pearl Harbor were not forgotten. They served as fuel for the fire of American resolve. The United States had entered the war wounded and humiliated, but in less than 2 years, it had become the dominant military and industrial power in the world, and the Axis powers were about to learn that awakening the sleeping giant had been a fatal mistake. From Coral Sea to Midway, how American forces seized the initiative. In the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan seemed unstoppable. Its forces swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with terrifying speed, seizing territory, resources, and strategic positions. But beneath the surface, American forces were regrouping, learning. The turning point came in the spring and summer of 1942, in a series of naval battles that demonstrated America's growing strength and tactical ingenuity. The first major engagement came in May 1942 in the Coral Sea northeast of Australia. Japanese forces were advancing toward Port Moresby in New Guinea, threatening Australia and Allied supply lines. American intelligence, having broken Japanese naval codes, knew the attack was coming. For the first time in naval history, 2 fleets engaged without ever seeing each other. All attacks were carried out by carrier-based aircraft. The USS Lexington and USS Yorktown faced off against Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. The battle was tactically inconclusive. Both sides suffered heavy losses, and the Lexington was sunk, but strategically, it was an American victory. The Japanese invasion of Port Moresby was halted, and 2 Japanese carriers were damaged or depleted, removing them from the next critical battle. That battle would come 1 month later at Midway Atoll, a tiny speck in the Central Pacific. Midway would prove to be the most decisive naval engagement of the Pacific War, and one of the most important battles in American military history. Admiral Yamamoto planned to lure the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet into a trap at Midway, where Japanese carriers and battleships would destroy them once and for all. He assembled a massive armada, 4 fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and hundreds of aircraft. But once again, American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, knew exactly when and where the attack would come. Despite having only 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown Nimitz positioned his forces northeast of Midway and waited. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese aircraft launched strikes against Midway Island itself. American planes from the island fought back, but the defenses were overwhelmed. Meanwhile, American carrier planes were searching for the Japanese fleet. Torpedo bombers from all 3 American carriers attacked first, flying low and slow toward the enemy ships. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire tore them apart. Of the 41 Devastator torpedo bombers launched, only 6 survived, and they scored no hits. The sacrifice seemed in vain, but those torpedo attacks had drawn Japanese fighters down to sea level. When American dive bombers arrived minutes later, the skies above the Japanese carriers were nearly empty. At approximately 10:22, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown screamed down on the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Bombs struck flight decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. The resulting explosions set off chain reactions of fire and destruction. Within minutes, all 3 carriers were blazing infernos. A 4th carrier, Hirohito, launched a counterattack that crippled the Yorktown. But American planes found and destroyed Hirohito later that afternoon. By the end of the day, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and many of its most experienced pilots. The Americans lost 1 carrier, a destroyer, and fewer than 150 aircraft. Midway shattered Japanese naval dominance in the Pacific. Japan would never again possess the offensive strength it had enjoyed in the first 6 months of the war. From Midway onward, the initiative belonged to the United States. The victory at Midway was not just a triumph of ships and planes, it was a triumph of intelligence, training, courage, and industrial power. The codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had provided the decisive advantage. American pilots, many of whom were inexperienced, had fought with determination and skill, and behind them stood American factories, already producing replacement carriers, planes, and pilots faster than losses could mount. Following Midway, American strategy in the Pacific took shape. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding forces in the Southwest Pacific, would advance northward from Australia through New Guinea and the Philippines. Admiral Nimitz, commanding the Central Pacific, would launch an island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific toward Japan. The strategy was to seize key islands, bypass heavily defended positions, and cut Japanese supply lines. Each island taken would become a base for the next leap forward, bringing American bombers closer to the Japanese home islands. The first test of this strategy came in August 1942 at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. Japanese forces were building an airfield there, threatening Allied supply lines to Australia. The U.S. Marines launched an amphibious assault, seizing the airfield renamed Henderson Field and igniting a brutal 6-month campaign. The fighting on Guadalcanal was savage. Marines battled not only Japanese troops but also malaria, dysentery, and the oppressive jungle environment. Naval battles raged offshore Savo Island, Eastern Solomons, Cape Esperance, Santa Cruz, and the climactic naval battle of Guadalcanal in November. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but American industrial output ensured that lost ships and planes could be replaced. By February 1943, Japanese forces evacuated Guadalcanal, conceding defeat. It was Japan's first major land defeat of the war, and it marked the beginning of a relentless American offensive that would continue without pause until Japan's surrender. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, American forces advanced across the Pacific. Marines and Army divisions stormed beaches at Tarawa, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Saipan, Guam, and Peleliu. Each assault was costly. Japanese defenders fought to the last man, preferring death to surrender. Banzai charges, hidden bunkers, and intricate cave systems turned every island into a killing ground. At Tarawa in November 1943, Marines suffered over 3,000 casualties in 76 hours of fighting for a tiny atoll. But with each victory, American forces moved closer to Japan, and American dominance grew stronger. In the Southwest Pacific, MacArthur's forces advanced through New Guinea in a series of amphibious leapfrog operations. By mid-1944, they had reached the Philippines. In October, MacArthur fulfilled his promise, wading ashore at Leyte and declaring, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." The liberation of the Philippines triggered the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. Over 3 days, American and Japanese fleets clashed in a series of engagements across hundreds of miles. The Japanese Navy, desperate to halt the American advance, committed its remaining carriers and battleships. The result was a catastrophic defeat. Japan lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. By early 1945, American forces stood on Japan's doorstep. Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the final stepping stones before the home islands, became the sites of 2 of the war's bloodiest battles. On Iwo Jima, Marines fought for 36 days to secure an 8-square-mile volcanic island. The iconic photograph of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi became one of the most enduring images of American resolve. On Okinawa, the fighting lasted 82 days. Japanese forces, supported by kamikaze attacks, inflicted heavy casualties, but American firepower and determination prevailed. By June, Okinawa was secure, and Japan was within range of American bombers. Throughout this period, the United States demonstrated not just military strength, but the ability to learn, adapt, and innovate. Amphibious assault techniques pioneered in the Pacific became the blueprint for modern combined arms operations. Carrier task forces developed tactics that rendered battleships obsolete. American logistics delivering fuel, ammunition, food, and replacement troops across thousands of miles of ocean was unmatched, and American industrial production ensured that no matter how fierce the resistance, American forces always had the resources to keep advancing. By mid-1945, Japan was defeated in all but name. Its navy was destroyed, its air force decimated, its cities under relentless bombing. Yet the Japanese government refused to surrender, clinging to the hope that a costly invasion of the home islands might force a negotiated peace. That hope would be shattered in August, when the full weight of American scientific and industrial power descended in the form of the atomic bomb. How American science and resolve brought the war to a swift and terrible end. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe had ended with Germany's surrender in May. In the Pacific, Japan stood alone, besieged on all sides but refusing to capitulate. American B-29, superfortress bombers, flying from bases in the Mariana Islands, had been conducting a relentless strategic bombing campaign against Japanese cities. Firebombing raids reduced Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of other cities to ashes. The attack on Tokyo on the night of March 9-10 alone killed over 100,000 civilians and left 1 million homeless. Yet, despite the devastation, Japan's military leadership insisted on fighting to the bitter end. American planners faced a grim calculation. Invading Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, would be the largest amphibious operation in history, dwarfing even D-Day. Intelligence estimates projected casualties in the hundreds of thousands for American forces, with Japanese military and civilian deaths potentially reaching into the millions. Japanese propaganda called on the entire population to resist, arming civilians with bamboo spears and preparing for a final, suicidal defense. After the fanatical resistance witnessed at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, American commanders had no illusions about the cost of an invasion. President Harry Truman, who had assumed office after Roosevelt's death in April, faced one of history's most consequential decisions. In his hands lay the culmination of the Manhattan Project, a weapon so powerful that it could obliterate entire cities in an instant. The atomic bomb, tested successfully at Alamogordo, New Mexico, on July 16, 1945, represented the zenith of American scientific and industrial capability. Its use, Truman believed, could end the war swiftly and save countless American lives and, paradoxically, Japanese lives as well, by avoiding a prolonged invasion. On July 26, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender and warning of prompt and utter destruction if the demand was refused. Japan's government, dominated by hardliners, rejected the ultimatum. Truman authorized the use of the atomic bomb. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, took off from Tinian Island carrying a uranium-based atomic bomb nicknamed Little Boy. At 8:15, the bomb was released over Hiroshima, a city of over 300,000 people and a significant military and industrial center. 43 seconds later, at an altitude of 1,900 feet, the bomb detonated. The explosion released energy equivalent to 15 kilotons of TNT. A blinding flash of light seared the sky. The temperature at ground zero reached several million degrees, instantly vaporizing everything within a half-mile radius. A massive fireball expanded outward, followed by a shock wave that flattened buildings for miles. Tens of thousands died instantly. Fires ignited across the city, merging into a firestorm that consumed everything in its path. A towering mushroom cloud rose over 30,000 feet into the sky, visible for miles. By the end of the day, an estimated 70,000 people were dead, with tens of thousands more injured or dying from radiation exposure. The world had never seen anything like it. Survivors described a hell on earth: charred bodies, rivers clogged with the dead, buildings reduced to skeletal ruins. Those caught in the blast but not immediately killed suffered horrific burns and radiation sickness. The scale of destruction from a single bomb defied comprehension. Yet Japan's government did not surrender. The military leadership, skeptical of reports and unwilling to accept defeat, continued to argue for continued resistance. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb, a plutonium-based weapon nicknamed Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. The city, an important port and industrial center, was largely destroyed. Another 40,000 to 70,000 people died. The message was clear. America possessed multiple atomic bombs and the will to use them. On the same day, the Soviet Union, honoring its agreement with the Allies, declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria. Soviet forces overwhelmed the Japanese Kwantung Army in a matter of days. Japan now faced annihilation from two directions: atomic bombs from the air and Soviet armies from the north. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito made an unprecedented radio address to the Japanese people. In a recorded message broadcast across the nation, he announced Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration and the decision to surrender. His voice, never before heard publicly, was strained and formal. He spoke of enduring the unendurable and accepting defeat to preserve the nation. For the first time in its history, Japan had been conquered. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the proceedings as representatives of the Japanese government signed the Instrument of Surrender. Standing behind MacArthur were representatives of the Allied nations, Britain, China, the Soviet Union, Australia, and others, but it was America that dominated the moment. The Pacific War had been, overwhelmingly, an American effort. American forces had borne the brunt of the fighting. American industry had supplied the weapons, and American resolve had brought Japan to its knees. MacArthur's words at the ceremony captured the gravity of the moment. "It is my earnest hope, indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding, a world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice." The war was over, but the world had changed irrevocably. The atomic bomb had ushered in a new era, one in which the destructive power of weapons had reached apocalyptic levels. America had emerged from the war not just victorious, but as the world's preeminent superpower. Its military was the most powerful, its economy the most productive, and its influence global. The cost had been enormous. Over 400,000 Americans had died in the war, 111,000 in the Pacific alone. Millions of Japanese, Chinese, Filipinos, and others had perished. Cities lay in ruins. Entire populations were displaced. Yet from the ashes, a new order would rise, shaped and dominated by American power. The sleeping giant, awakened on December 7, 1941, had proven unstoppable. In less than 4 years, the United States had mobilized its industrial might, defeated 2 global powers, and reshaped the world. The question now was not whether America was dominant, but what kind of world American dominance would create. How Pearl Harbor shaped America's global dominance for generations. The attack on Pearl Harbor did more than force America into war, it fundamentally transformed the nation's place in the world. On December 7, 1941, the United States was a reluctant power, economically strong but militarily modest, inclined toward isolation and wary of foreign entanglements. By September 2, 1945, it had become the world's unquestioned superpower, with military reach spanning the globe, an economy that dwarfed all others, and a nuclear arsenal that gave it unparalleled strategic dominance. The transformation was staggering in both speed and scale. American military spending during the war exceeded $300 billion, nearly half of the total Allied war expenditure. By war's end, the United States produced 2/3 of the world's industrial output. American factories, shipyards, and laboratories had demonstrated a capacity for innovation and mass production that no other nation could match. The war effort had lifted America out of the Great Depression, putting millions to work and creating a booming economy that would define the post-war era. Militarily, the United States emerged from the war with the largest navy in the world, the most advanced air force, a battle-tested army, and exclusive possession of the atomic bomb. American forces occupied Japan and parts of Germany, projecting power across both oceans. The demobilization that followed saw millions of servicemen return home. But America did not retreat into isolation as it had after the First World War. Instead, it embraced a new role: global leadership. This shift was enshrined in the institutions America helped create in the post-war period. The United Nations, established in 1945 with its headquarters in New York, reflected American ideals of collective security and international cooperation. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 established the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, both dominated by American influence and designed to stabilize the global economy under a dollar-based system. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1947, funneled over $13 billion into rebuilding Western Europe, securing American influence, and creating prosperous trading partners. These initiatives were not acts of pure altruism, they served American strategic and economic interests, but they also reflected a vision of a stable, prosperous, American-led international order. In Asia, the occupation of Japan became one of history's most remarkable transformations. Under General MacArthur's administration, Japan's militaristic government was dismantled, war criminals prosecuted, and democratic institutions established. A new constitution, drafted largely by American advisors, renounced war and established civil liberties. Land reform broke up feudal estates, labor unions were legalized, and women gained the right to vote. The transformation was not without controversy or resistance, but by the 1950s, Japan had emerged as a peaceful, democratic, and economically vibrant nation anchored firmly within the American sphere of influence. The Philippines, long an American colony, gained independence in 1946 as promised, yet American military bases remained, cementing the Philippines' strategic importance in the Pacific. Across the region, American influence expanded through alliances, military bases, and economic ties. The Cold War, which emerged as the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union, crumbled, solidified America's role as the leader of the free world in opposition to Soviet communism. At home, the war's legacy was equally profound. The generation that fought in World War II, the greatest generation, returned to a nation forever changed. The GI Bill provided education, housing loans, and business startup capital to millions of veterans, fueling the growth of the American middle class. Suburbs expanded, highways were built, and consumer culture flourished. The economic prosperity of the post-war decades was built on the industrial base and technological innovations developed during the war. Yet the war also left scars and unresolved contradictions. African American veterans, who had fought for freedom abroad, returned to a segregated society. Their service and sacrifice would fuel the civil rights movement in the decades ahead. Japanese Americans, released from internment camps, faced years of rebuilding their lives, their property lost, and their reputations tarnished. Native Americans, who had served in disproportionately high numbers, including the famed Navajo code talkers, returned to reservations plagued by poverty and neglect. Women, who had proven their capability in factories and military roles, were encouraged to return to domestic life, though many resisted. The contradictions between America's wartime rhetoric of freedom and its domestic inequalities would shape the nation's internal struggles for decades. Internationally, America's atomic monopoly was short-lived. The Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb in 1949, sparking a nuclear arms race that defined the Cold War. The threat of mutual annihilation hung over the world for nearly half a century, and the shadow of Pearl Harbor, the danger of surprise attack, shaped American defense policy. The establishment of a permanent military-industrial complex, early warning systems, global surveillance networks, and forward-deployed forces reflected a determination that America would never again be caught off guard. The memory of Pearl Harbor itself became a cornerstone of American identity. "Remember Pearl Harbor" had been the rallying cry during the war, and after the war, it remained a symbol of American resilience and determination. Memorials were erected, museums established, and the USS Arizona, still resting on the harbor floor with over 1,000 sailors entombed within, became a sacred site. Every December 7th, ceremonies honor those who died. For generations of Americans, Pearl Harbor represented the moment when the nation awoke to its responsibilities and rose to meet them. But Pearl Harbor's legacy extends beyond memory and symbolism. It fundamentally reshaped American strategic thinking. The attack demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most powerful forces, the importance of intelligence and preparedness, and the necessity of maintaining overwhelming military strength. The doctrine of peace through strength, the emphasis on technological superiority, and the global network of bases and alliances all trace their origins to the lessons learned after December 7th, 1941. The war that began at Pearl Harbor also marked the beginning of the American century. From 1945 onward, American culture, technology, economic systems, and political ideals spread across the globe. Hollywood films, American music, blue jeans, and Coca-Cola became symbols of modernity and freedom. English became the language of international business and diplomacy. American companies dominated global markets. The dollar became the world's reserve currency. This dominance was built on the foundation of the industrial, military, and scientific mobilization that began in the wake of Pearl Harbor. Yet this dominance was never absolute and came with responsibilities and costs. America found itself embroiled in conflicts across the globe: Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, often in defense of allies or in opposition to perceived threats. The burden of leadership weighed heavily, and the idealism that followed World War II gave way to the complexities and compromises of the Cold War and beyond. Still, the transformation that began on December 7, 1941, remains one of history's most significant. A nation attacked without warning, its fleet crippled, its people shocked and grieving, rose to dominate the world in less than 4 years. That rise was fueled by industrial might, technological innovation, strategic brilliance, and the determination of millions of Americans who refused to accept defeat. Pearl Harbor forced America into war, but in doing so, it forged a superpower whose influence would shape the 20th century and beyond. The attack, intended to cripple American resolve, instead ignited a fury and determination that reshaped the global order. Admiral Yamamoto's fear proved tragically accurate. Japan had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. And that resolve, born in the fires of Pearl Harbor, endures. A reminder that the strength of a nation lies not just in its military or economy, but in the unity, resilience, and determination of its people when faced with the unthinkable. If stories like this help illuminate the defining moments of history, consider supporting the channel. Like, share, and subscribe to keep these untold and unforgettable stories alive.